Please stand by. We're about to begin. Good day and welcome to the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse's Impact of Incarceration on Families, Communities, and Offenders webinar. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Kristin Anderson Moore, Senior Scholar at Child Trends, and today's webinar moderator. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kris Moore, and I'm a member of the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse team. Before we delve into today's main topic, I'll give you just a brief tour of the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, or SSRC, which is sponsored by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the Office of Administration for Children and Families in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The SSRC, as I believe you know, is a virtual portal of research on low-income families and vulnerable populations, and it's an online hub for professional networking among researchers, practitioners, and policymakers who serve these populations. Our online library currently holds over 4,300 items, and we add new resources on a regular basis. Our research materials are organized into 12 main topics, which are shown in the drop-down screen on this slide. Next, this 3-minute video will show you the library and all of its search features, both quickly and efficiently.
Hi, I'm Linda. Let me show you how I use the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse Library to find helpful resources on two-generation strategies to promote self-sufficiency. I'm the new director of a county social services agency, and I'm planning for our agency to take a more holistic, two-generation approach to help reduce our county's child poverty rate and improve self-sufficiency outcomes for our struggling local families. To start, I selected Search Library from the light blue tabs toward the top of the site. Then Go to Library on the drop-down menu. This takes you to the main library search page. There are a lot of ways to broaden or narrow your initial search in your results by selecting or deselecting options. In the left column, you can narrow results by topical area, popular search terms, source, year of the publication, reference type, methodology, geographic focus, and target population, which are really helpful filters to have when looking for specific information. In the center of the page, you can enter custom search terms. Select this exact phrase instead of using quotation marks. There are also advanced search options that let you limit your custom search to just the abstract text, title, author's name, or publication name. I searched the full text by typing two-generation in the search text box. Then I selected this exact phrase and hit the blue button to start my search. This library contains thousands of resources, so the search may take a minute or so. My initial search generated more than 80 results on this topic, so I narrowed the focus. I selected childcare under topical areas in the left column to narrow the results to childcare-related resources. With my background in early childhood education, I'm more comfortable implementing two-generation approaches that incorporate high-quality childcare solutions. That gave me 31 resources on two-generation strategies in childcare. I'll select one so you can see the full library entry. Once you've selected a resource, you'll be able to review its abstract and details all on one page, including its author, the research methodology used, when it was published, the target population, and geographic focus. This made it easy to scan the results and see if the resource was on target with my current needs. One last thing. Select the public URL to directly access the resource on the publisher's website. If the full text is not available to you, contact SSRC at opressrc.org. We may be able to send you a single copy for your personal use. With today's focus on evidence-based and evidence-informed practices, searching the SSRC library has been a really helpful tool. In a few years, we expect to publish early evaluation results on our two-generation approach, and we'll submit those.
Thank you. Next, under the Stay Connected tab at opressrc.org, You'll find entities involved in the self-sufficiency research and a list of organizations that have partnered with the SSRC to host events and share publications related to the field of self-sufficiency. You'll also find an events calendar with in-person and virtual events relevant to the field of self-sufficiency. To find past webinar recordings and materials, select the Search Library tab. Finally, select the Use Data tab to find a comprehensive list of data sets and sources that support program management and facilitate improved outcomes for children, families, and communities. On the right side of your screen, you'll find links to SSRC web pages, including our Emerging Scholars page and the library. Select any of the titles, then click the Browse button, and your selection will open in a new window. On this slide, we provide the selection criteria for the Emerging Scholar. This person should be a graduate student or a degree recipient with no more than 10 years of experience, who's currently doing research on self-sufficiency issues related to the SSRC topic areas, conducting high-quality research that fills a knowledge gap or addresses a self-sufficiency issue that warrants greater visibility. And we're interested in emerging scholars who may be working in an academic setting, a program setting, a think tank, or an agency setting. And this slide identifies previous emerging scholars. You may recognize some of the names, and you'll notice that their research ranges from topics like healthcare and health insurance to family structure, incarceration, and asset depletion among low-income populations. Today's webinar features research by Dr. Artika Tyner. She's an assistant professor within the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Administration at the College of Education at the University of St. Thomas. Dr. Tyner's research interests include social justice movements, organizational leadership, and civil rights and community development. She is an advisory board member of the Children's Defense Fund in Minnesota and a board member at the ABA Council for Racial and Ethnic Diversity in the Educational Pipeline. She received her Doctor of Education degree in Education in Leadership from the University of St. Thomas in 2012, and she also holds a Juris Doctor degree from the same university. Dr. Renée Wilson-Simmons will be our discussant on today's webinar. Dr. Wilson-Simmons is the director of the National Center for Children in Poverty, and she's also a member of the SSRC's Technical Working Group. Her research interests include child and adolescent health and development, poverty, and public policy. She's a member of Academy Health, the Child and Family Policy Consortium, and the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health Mass Incarceration Work Group. Dr. Renée Wilson-Simmons received her Doctor of Public Health degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And please feel free to submit questions to our speakers at any time through the question and answer feature at the bottom right side of the webinar platform. Even if we do not get to all questions today, we'll post responses to all submitted questions on the SSRC website, along with the other webinar materials within coming weeks. Please note we will not be accepting questions over the phone or by Twitter, so please use the Q&A box on the right for question submission. And if you hear something during the webinar that you think others should know, please tweet about it using hashtag #SSRCwebinar. And now we will turn to Dr. Artika Tyner to talk about the effect of prison phone communication on children, families, communities, and offenders. Dr. Tyner?
Thank you for the warm introduction. I'm excited to share my research on the impact and effect of prison phone communication on children, families, communities, and offenders. I first would like to start by acknowledging some of the partners who helped to bring this research project to fruition. The first two, the Campaign for Prison Phone Justice and the Center for Media Justice, have advanced national advocacy to bring forth change related to prison phone justice. Also the Children's Defense Fund and their work in protecting children's rights and also looking at the impact of incarceration on children. And the Community Justice Project a civil rights clinic, which supported and also participated in the research process. And finally, a special thank you to the participants of the Power of People Leadership Institute. These were the men who served as the research participants for this particular study that I'll highlight today. So for a general overview, I'll begin by looking at some of the trends in incarceration nationally. I'll also focus on the economic and social impacts of incarceration on children, families, and communities. Then I'll introduce qualitative research as the tool and methodology for my data analysis and collection. And next, I'll talk about prison phone justice more broadly as a policy initiative. And then finally, we'll look at some of the implications of this particular research study. So beginning with setting the framework for this particular topic today is looking at defining incarceration. And I have here a definition from Black's Law Dictionary that gives us a general sense that incarceration, and the way that I will use it today in the context of this study, is looking at imprisonment or confinement in a jail or penitentiary or state prison. So if we look at a general overview of trends in incarceration, as you can see with the first point in 1972, having fewer than 350,000 people incarcerated nationwide. And then as we fast forward to today, the U.S. has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, with over 2 million people who are incarcerated. And if we put this into context for the global nature of this issue, that the U.S. represents about 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. So if you look at, and we'll go specifically to take a closer look at the trends, once again on this particular slide, you can see that 1972 mark as a place marker, and then fast forwarding to 2013, you see this within this visual of the rapid growth in incarceration. And one of the contributing factors that research has demonstrated, and seeing that trend move upwards quite rapidly, is related to the war on drugs and the increase of incarceration rates for those who are considered nonviolent drug offenders. So in beginning our analysis and taking a closer look and setting the context for my study, the first thing that we're going to take a look at is the fiscal impact. So what are the economic costs associated with incarceration? So in 2010, we have over $80 billion that was spent specifically on corrections. The second point highlights, once again, those trends that we saw over the past 2 to 3 decades of seeing an increase in the amount of spending in correctional budgets. This one showing them that there was $17 billion spent in 1980 compared to in 2010 over $80 billion spent on corrections. The final point is the average cost of incarceration. Now this is based upon a national average that brings that cost to about $31,000. But if we look more broadly, we have some states where incarceration is upwards of $50,000 to $60,000 annually. Looking more broadly and setting then a context on the fiscal impact of incarceration, I wanted to put in a frame of reference. If we compare correction spending versus education spending, we see, with looking first at California, that's listed first here, we see nearly a 5 times the rate of money spent for corrections versus education, or the money that's invested in K through 12 education. If we look nationally, studies have demonstrated that it's on an average about 4 times as much that we spend in our corrections budget versus how much we spend on education. So also looking at this on a larger scope of how are we investing our dollars as a nation related to prevention, intervention strategies as well. So then looking specifically at the social impacts, what are the social costs of incarceration? Now truly in this conversation, we primarily focused on the offender or the prisoner. But my hope is that we can look at this and frame this issue more broadly, to also look at the impact on family members, community members, and children. By recognizing that incarceration moves beyond just the person who's physically confined and incarcerated in a facility to a larger question on the social ramifications and the impact on others who are within their circle, and more broadly the community and the nation at large related to these economic impact that I had talked about earlier. For one particular group, I'd like to focus on primarily its children. With nearly 3 million children who have an incarcerated parent, they're oftentimes the invisible victims of incarceration. Now, I have here a picture here on the right of Alex. And I'm not sure if Alex is familiar to you, but Alex was introduced in 2013 to the Sesame Street cast. And basically the purpose of Alex's character was to raise national awareness about the challenges that children face who have an incarcerated parent. So this was one of the first opportunities to bring it to a national audience to start grappling with how are these children impacted and what are the long-term ramifications on children. So expanding that conversation related to social impact. You can see here that 62% of women who are incarcerated are mothers and 51% of men who are incarcerated are fathers. Further, an additional piece of the social impact that we can't ignore is the disproportionate impact on communities of color. Now, this particular data that I have listed here in reference is from Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. Specifically, if we look at Jim Crow, which is referenced on the left-hand side of that period from 1876 to the mid-1960s, you see emerging then African Americans in particular entering into the criminal justice system based upon laws and policies. But one of the things that Professor Alexander highlights in her research is in fast forwarding to today, what are some of the disparities that we see that impact the African American community and communities of color more broadly? So as we take a look at this particular chart from the Sentencing Project, we get a sense of, with black men representing 1 in 3 of the likelihood of imprisonment, and then we see 1 in 18 for black women, and also we see a trend related to a disproportionate rate of entry into the justice system and incarceration for both Latino men and Latino women. So we see that there's also an underlying policy issue to think about strategically of what are some of the trends related to how communities of color are impacted. So to then focus specifically related to my research was exploring then the question of how do we take a closer look at the social and the economic impacts on family members? How are they impacted by incarceration? So the first thing that I began to look at was communication. And knowing then that communication between a prisoner and their family and other community members serves as a critical lifeline. And we have a quote here from Nelson Mandela, who spent over 27 years in prison. And this quote is from The Long Walk to Freedom. And with this particular quote, one of the things that it leaves us to think about is the nature of communication being an integral part of building, strengthening, and maintaining relationships. He characterizes it as a human right by acknowledging that a part of our humanity is our ability to communicate and connect with others. So this led to my research question of how does contact or lack of contact affect prisoners, the prison system, and prisoners' family members? And just to be specific, when we launched this particular research project and endeavor, at that point, the average cost of a prison phone call was roughly about $1 per minute. So for many families, the cost alone of the prison phone call had created an active barrier for remaining in contact with their incarcerated loved one. So the first thing that we took a look at was how does it impact reintegration and recidivism. And one of the studies that stood out specifically related to this is a study from out of Florida. It looked at 7,000 prisoners and the impact on maintaining routine communication on their future success related to reintegration. And they measured reintegration by looking at whether or not someone returned to prison, so that recidivism rate. And the discovery from that particular study was the fact that for those who had higher rates of communication, you then saw a direct correlation to lower rates of recidivism or future incarceration. And for background and context as well, for the effect on families, if we look at phone communication is one of the most accessible tools and means of communication because on the average, a prisoner is incarcerated at least 100 miles from home. So if we look at that specifically, a phone call is something that's practical and that most people would have access to to be able to remain in contact with their incarcerated loved one on a routine basis. If we look at children again, once again, nearly 3 million children have an incarcerated parent. What is the impact on children? Now, this particular quote that I have listed here is from the FCC, and it's related to the period of public comments that was open for community members, for researchers to give insights related to the effect on prison phone communication on children. And you can see here that the lack of regular contact with incarcerated parents have been linked to some detrimental effects like truancy, homelessness, depression, and also impacting the dynamics in the classroom and classroom performance. So as we look at this, the next piece, I focused on the essence of how do we ensure that we're building strong families as a theme, but also safe communities. And this goes back to that Florida study that I had highlighted, that by maintaining routine and consistent contact with family members, close friends, and community members while in prison, you then see a connection to decreasing recidivism and then improving the ability for a prisoner to reintegrate into the community in the future. And specifically related to my research methodology, I use qualitative research as my methodological framework to explore this question of looking at the effects of lack of contact for prisoners and their families. So it was twofold. I combined survey research to get a general context of how prison phone calls had any impact at all. What was the impact? Would the prisoners would have liked to have additional impact? Who did they want to remain in contact with? But then we also use qualitative research as a tool to be able to get more specific information about lived experience of the prisoners, to hear their stories. So if we distinguish the quantitative research piece versus the qualitative research piece, it was an opportunity to get a glimpse into the data coming alive. What were the experiences, what were the feelings, and what were some of the kind of recommendations for change that some of the research participants had as well. So if we look at specifically the methodology, it was a purposeful selection of selecting those who had been incarcerated and also who had desire to use phone communication as a tool to remain in contact with their family members and community members. So specifically, the recruiting process was through a snowballing. We received referrals from community partners who had worked with men or women who had been incarcerated, and based upon that, that's when we secured and built the partnership with conducting the research specifically with the Power of the People Leadership Institute. The criteria, as I had outlined before, was that they were previously incarcerated, each of the research participants, and had used the phone as a means of communication. Now, I also will note here, before I go into the sample characteristics, that with qualitative research, specifically in this context, although it was a small sample, a sample of 14, it gave us a sense of an in-depth analysis of some of the challenges and barriers associated with communication. So for ages, we had a wide age range from the ages of 21 to 65 years old. As you look under race and ethnicity, you can see that the vast majority of the participants were from a diverse background. As I had said before, gender, all of the participants were males. And then for location of incarceration, now there were some variations here. Most were incarcerated somewhere in the Midwest, but several participants had also been in multiple different prisons. Additionally, if we ask the question of how long were they incarcerated, once again, there was some variation here with being incarcerated for less than 1 year to more than 10 years. And then also one of the survey questions was related to identifying the family members that the prisoners had attempted to stay in contact with. And as you can see here, there's a full list of family members and community members and others within their support network. But the majority maintained that they had a special desire and longing to stay in touch with their parents and their children. So the initial survey findings were, as far as the question of desired contact, 11 of the 14 participants said that they did not have as much phone contact as they would have desired. Secondly, we also asked what were some of the things that limited phone contact. And you can see here from the two main responses, primarily it was related to money. The first one being the issue that the prisoners cannot afford to pay for the prison phone calls based upon their current wages. And second, many were concerned that they would place a financial burden on their family members, and that family members would also then have to make a difficult choice between accepting their phone calls and meeting some of their other budgetary needs. So one of the open-ended questions that we concluded with for the survey was an open-ended question of what are the benefits of remaining in contact? And you can see the list here. Primarily, it was related to identity. It was related to that sense that Nelson Mandela talked about, staying connected, strengthening the familial bond, and also just that sense of humanity that comes through communication and exchange. Now, for me, I know one of the points that stood out was the final point. If you nurture a plant, it grows. If you comfort a loved one incarcerated, it encourages his awareness of being loved. I think that also translated into, as we looked at the themes from this research, that sense of being connected to families, but also that sense of being connected to community for successful reintegration. For the listening session, and that's when we opened up the opportunity through a focus group type format to hear the stories of the men, this is when they talked a lot about what were the feelings, what were the emotions related to phone contact. And the particular quote that I highlighted here was, when you are on the inside, you start to feel like nobody cares about you. So how do you make and foster those connections once again? I now would like to highlight a specific experience. I'm referring to this particular research participant as Respondent A. Respondent A was incarcerated at the age of 19. Based upon the high cost of prison phone calls and also just that travel piece that I talked about that can serve as a barrier to visitation, he received little family contact. And he makes his own assessment that over time he became more and more animalistic. And he characterized that in a way that he felt disconnected to others. So he was released after a short period of time, so he had a short prison sentence. But he talked about how that lack of communication that created this barrier between him and making that transition to reintegration. So he talks about this lost connection with the outside world, and that leading to recidivism for him, returning back to prison within just a short length of time. We also had a sense of one of the issues that serves as an active barrier to reintegration is access to housing. Now, for many, access to housing is a condition or a precursor to either parole or probation as well, and just overall that sense of reintegration, the stability of housing. So one participant shared a sense of having regular phone communication serving a vital role in his ability to later secure employment or housing. But the other issue that it also correlated with was employment, of being able to build the bridges to secure both housing and employment. So what are the implications of this research? Where do we go from here? Now, as far as conclusions, I talked about this generally as the sense of what qualitative research provided for us, in the sense of exploring the lived experiences of families and children through the eyes of those who had formerly been incarcerated, and also to get a sense of those two themes that I talked about, of strong families and safe communities. How do you maintain those familial relationships, and what strategies can be used to reduce recidivism? As I look ahead to the future, areas of research that I would like to explore, the first one being how the budgets of states which have eliminated or reduced commissions been impacted. For instance, with reduced call costs, has that led to increased call volume? And then if we look at it specifically, if there is more communication by phone, does that also help to reduce recidivism? Can we document some of those relationships to each other? The second piece, and this fits directly into an analysis of self-sufficiency, is that once we started doing the research related to prison phone calls or inmate calling services providers and their work, we also started to see that there were other fees associated with family members trying to support their incarcerated loved one. For instance, one of the fees that's often overlooked is the cost of sending money to the books or to the account of one of their family members who's been incarcerated. How does that impact families' ability to meet their budgetary responsibilities outside versus making sure that they're financing and supporting their loved one who's incarcerated inside? So that would be another area of exploration. And also as we look at policy implications, one piece of what this study was able to do was help to raise awareness about the importance of phone communication, and then also identifying some of the barriers. What were families facing in trying to remain in contact and build relationships with their incarcerated family member, and also just creating a forum to engage in a dialogue. So letting this research be a conversation starter, a beginning to a larger dialogue related to what are the effects of incarceration beyond looking at just the prisoner alone, who else is impacted and how and why. Additionally, the policy campaign that I referred to earlier for the Campaign for Prison Phone Justice, now that's been a coalition of national partners who have organized to address the high cost of prison phone calls, to make sure that prison phone calls are fair, equitable, and just. So just to set the context related to this specifically, there are a handful of companies like Globotel Link and Securus who enter into contractual agreements with state prisons or county jails to offer prison phone call services. And as a result, in exchange for securing that contract, those facilities then receive commissions. And if we look at just the overall amount, this yields roughly about $152 million annually, nationally, for some of the state prisons and county jails. This resulted in the advocacy work of the Campaign for Prison Phone Justice in trying to shape a narrative related to the challenges and the barriers that families face when they have this heightened financial burden. So this is a working definition of prison phone justice and what the advocates who are working on this national campaign seek to achieve. Next, I would like to talk just briefly about Martha Wright, who is in the picture on the right-hand side. And I also included a video link where you could listen to her own reflections related to the challenges of having her grandson incarcerated in another state and trying to figure out how she could remain in contact. So having a blind grandmother on a limited budget, struggling to say, I'd like to be able to keep in contact with my grandson, and would like to ensure that our contact's not limited by cost, that our communication can be accessible, and it can be routine, and it can help prepare the way for her grandson to return back home successfully. And as we look at specifically, as I had started earlier, taking a look at the economic implications. Now this particular, these two quotes are from the testimony of Bethany Frazier. Now Bethany Frazier testified at the FCC's hearing related to prison phone calls and inmate calling services. And she talked specifically about the experience of having an incarcerated husband and the experience of having two children at that time, 5 and 10 years old, who still needed the important role of their father and their, throughout their key critical childhood years. And she talks about losing over half of the family's income and then gaining a painfully large phone bill. But also choosing, and this is the point that I highlighted earlier, that many of the research participants talked about having to make a difficult choice for their families between remaining in contact and accepting that collect prison phone call and other budgetary expenses that the family had. So if we look specifically at the Pew Center has done some research to try to get a sense of how are families impacted when there's an incarcerated parent. And based upon their research, a family with an incarcerated parent on the average earns 22% less the year after the incarceration than it did the year before. So clearly, if I summarize that, it's a sense of not having that other individual in the household, whether mother or father, the impact on the overall family's budget. So that's the economic impact. But I think what Mrs. Frazier also highlights is the social impact of how it impacted her children, of the need to be able to establish this ongoing communication so they could have a healthy relationship with their father. So as I conclude my remarks, I definitely would encourage you, if you'd like to continue the conversation about my research and some of the implications and some of the challenges facing families, children, and offenders, please feel free to follow me through any of these social media outlets. But I also encourage you to think about some of the messages and themes that we saw today on what are the strategies to ensure that we have strong families and safe communities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tyner. Going to encourage you again to submit questions. We have several to get started, and the Q&A box in the bottom right part of the screen. Now we are going to turn to Dr. Renée Wilson-Simmons, who will provide discussant remarks.
Thanks, Chris. And I am so pleased to be part of this discussion because it's one that I hope brings increased attention to this issue. And I want to commend Dr. Tyner for undertaking such powerful and important research because it's a kind of inquiry that really moves us beyond a just the facts focus, and it puts flesh and bone on an issue by giving voice to the struggles that families and offenders and communities are facing. And it's the kind of research that also helps us explore new areas of research and build new theories. So before posing a question to Dr. Tyner to kick off the next part of this webinar, I'd like to comment very briefly on why this issue is of importance to the National Center for Children in Poverty, and add a couple of comments to Dr. Tyner's description of the importance of communication during incarceration. And as a nonpartisan public policy research center that promotes the economic security, the health, the well-being of America's poor and low-income children and families, NCCP has a vision of an America where all families are economically secure, strong, and nurturing, and all children are supported so they thrive and grow into healthy adults. And we just have no doubt that to achieve that vision, one of the things we have to do is promote the eradication of mass incarceration, because that kind of incarceration and poverty are inextricably linked. And so in terms of this issue of communication, there have been a range of studies over many years presented by the Urban Institute, the Western Criminology Review, the Vera Institute, the American Correctional Association, among others, showing that there is this very strong and positive relationship between parole success and maintaining strong family ties while in prison. And obviously, as Dr. Tyner has succinctly described already, communication is the major way those ties are achieved. And so we know that there are three primary forms of communication available to prisoners: letters, visits, and phone calls. And we also know in terms of letters, many prisoners are illiterate or functionally illiterate, so that frustrates correspondence. And another issue when we talk about systems change is that an increasing number of jails are adopting postcard-only policies. That means that prisoners can only receive and sometimes send mail in the form of postcards. And this is a very limited means of correspondence. And I know that several organizations have challenged this policy. I know in Florida, Tennessee, Oregon, Washington, and Michigan, among others, but I really haven't followed this recently. Visitation is the second one, and in addition to being difficult, if not impossible, because as Dr. Tyner has already noted, the distance many families are from offenders is a barrier. It's often an unpleasant process. It involves lengthy waits, onerous searches, restricted visitation time, rigid enforcement of often petty rules. And so it's phone calls that we look to as a lifeline for many family and friends. And here we see through Dr. Tyner's research the barriers that exist. And so my question to Dr. Tyner is, because we know that systems change seldom comes without policy change, what did you do with your research to help promote policy change related to phone calls?
We used the research as a tool to bring awareness, as you've already highlighted, to the lived experience of our research participants, and to know that they're not alone, that there are plenty other fathers and mothers who have experienced a similar situation and family members. So we submitted the findings of this particular research study to the FCC during a period where they opened up public comments to deal specifically with interstate calls, those calls that go across state lines, so the federal call system. And eventually, as far as once the record was closed, once the hearings and everything had taken place, there was specifically a call cap cost on those interstate calls, which is a safe harbor that references the fact that the call cost cannot exceed 25 cents, between 21 cents and 25 cents per minute.
Artika, one of the questions we've gotten, this is Chris Moore, is to describe the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Right. They oversee this?
Yes, they would oversee and have jurisdiction over this particular issue because it includes communication that's going both across state lines and also communication within states. So they would be the federal administrative agency that would oversee any policies and regulations related to prison phone calls. And it's important to note, in one of my end slides, I featured the picture of Martha Wright and the Wright petition. Now initially, the inquiry and the request for changes in policy reforms went through the state or the federal court system, and then moved, based upon her petition initially as a court case, being denied in the sense of not having jurisdiction, was placed in the policy arena for larger systemic change.
Mm-hmm. Question from this person is the report that you referred to in slide 29, he or she would like to obtain it. And can they contact you, or do they go to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission?
They can contact me, and I'd be more than willing to send over a link.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question that came in is that free calls are to be 5 minutes, but once the operator gives all the rules, the calls end up being 1 minute or less. Is that what you have found?
Well, as far as actual free call policies, now they may vary based upon the county or the state facility, or based upon the policies of the Bureau of Prisons. What I can tell you is if you take a look at and do some additional research into the particular companies that oversee most of the inmate calling services, like the Global Tel-Link or Securus, you will see that there are some real challenges related to the quality of calls, drop calls, length of calls, as this particular participant has referenced, of not having the full 5 minutes. So there are additional concerns that have been noted and listed through the Attorney General's office as well. So there are also some concerns related from consumer protection types of groups of whether or not the quality of the service equates to the same services that you would get through other calling services outside of prisons.
So a question here about Skype and FaceTime. Middle-class families use Skype and FaceTime. Are there any jurisdictions that are using these modes of communication between families and incarcerated persons?
There are jurisdictions who are using some of the video conferencing services, also email services, but one of the challenges is related to whether or not it will occur again that if you're the same type of regulatory challenges that you have of prison phone calls, will they also then equate to the internet services, the email services, or other considerations as well? So I give it just as an example that as far as a policy issue, we'd have to be cognizant of ensuring that it doesn't turn into the same challenges associated with the prison phone calls, with some of the commissions and other active barriers related to call costs, then translating into internet costs.
Thank you. A very specific question, whether you grouped Latinos in with the white category?
No, I did not.
Okay. Were there some Latinos? Yeah.
No, not as participants in this particular study.
Thank you. And question is, are all calls expensive for both the prisoner and the recipient? And if not, what determines who bears the burden?
Well, the call structure is twofold. Primarily, it's either through a collect call system, and that's, for instance, getting that message saying, you have a call from Global Tel Link, will you accept the call, press 0 type of thing. Or the second category is prepaid calls. So those could be the calls that prisoners either purchase call time through the commissary, or family members purchase a prepaid calling service. So depending on the latter category of prepaid calling services tend to be less expensive. However, one of the things, based upon my research, that I started to notice was that there are other costs associated with those prepaid services that drive up the call cost. Again, it's either charges for setting up an account, there's charges for putting money on to the account. So there are still some additional charges that are not visible sometimes to the physical eye, but would make prepaid calls in a lot of instances just as costly.
Interesting. And this is a question, and kind of a two-part question, and it might be that both of you might like to have something to say about it. The comment is, many people in the public still do not see a reason to keep the incarcerated parent involved in their children's lives. The second part is, do you have any data to support that maintaining and or creating healthy relationships between children and their incarcerated parents?
I can begin with a response related to the first issue, and I think that's a part of overall a stigma related to incarceration, of even saying, I mean, one of the challenges that if you think about more broadly is, who are prisoners? What are the barriers that they face upon reintegration, whether it's some of the barriers of access to jobs, housing, and other things. So I think it's a larger stigma that's placed on prisoners in general. But based upon the research, whether we look at the Pew Center's research or the Vera Institute that talks about this sense of vicarious loss, that when you have an incarcerated parent for a child, it's almost analogous to the same type of loss of death. So how do we help to mitigate, and based upon that slide that I talked about from the FCC report, some of those challenges that are a natural byproduct of interrupting the ability for parents and children to have a relationship. So I think the reality is that we need to raise additional public awareness on some of the ramifications of not having that stable relationship that would transcend beyond the prison gates or a jail cell, to say that that's still a parent who would like to or seek to be involved in a child's life. And then looking at the research from both Pew and Vera Institute, knowing that the emotional and toll on the children as well.
Renée, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh, yeah, the thing I would add is that we know from the research that children of incarcerated parents are more likely to experience internalizing disorders, to exhibit behavioral problems more than their peers. And some studies of parental incarceration of fathers as well as mothers suggested that children whose parents spend time in prison are not only more likely to exhibit antisocial behavior, but also to be involved with the criminal justice system as adolescents and be incarcerated as adults compared with children who don't experience parental imprisonment. So if we're talking about the fact that we understand that children do better when parents do better, and children need their parents for a range of developmental issues, and if we're talking about the importance of those children to our society, then we have to think much broader and deeper about the importance of that connection.
Thank you. Another question is, do you know of any jails or prisons that have been able to increase communication between inmates and family, and if so, what you can tell us about the impact?
Well, based specifically on the issue of prison phone calls, there have been at least a dozen states who have implemented through either policy or through enactment of laws and legal changes of eliminating or reducing the commissions based upon the phone call, so then drastically reducing the call cost. So for those particular states, they include states like California, New York, and New Mexico. one of the things that I would like to do is take a look at their data to see what has been the impact since they've decreased the call cost on call volume and access. So I'm still looking forward to receiving that data to look at some of those trends. Now, overall, there have been jails and prisons who have tried innovative things to increase, as Dr. Renée talked about, both access to visiting, also the access to letter writing and some of the other communications, and the video conferencing that you had also referenced. So I think one of the things still yet to be done is to gather and compile that research and specifically related to phone communication into one study, and to be able to publish those findings, because most of the research that's currently available is looking at communication more broadly, but we still need to have a direct sense of the importance of phone communication.
Okay. Well, here's a closely related question about cell phones. Is there any discussion at the research level about the ready availability of clandestine cell phones in most or all prisons, which kind of demonstrate that the tight control of normal family calls doesn't serve people's interests?
I'm not presently aware of any research in that arena. I will say that there was a report published by the Department of Justice that explored that as a public safety issue, and a part of the implication was looking at for future research and recommendations for change in order to address the security issue of mobile devices being smuggled into prisons. That one of the key things that would need to be looked at a national level is how do we make phone calls more accessible.
Next question is, why are we seeing so little political will to isolate the unprecedented rise of women in prison, most of whom are nonviolent offenders, often are co-defendants of their criminal paramour?
That's an excellent question. I actually had the privilege and honor yesterday evening to meet Piper Kerman, who wrote the book Orange is the New Black. And one of the things that she raised are those direct issues. Specifically, one of the data points that stood out to me is that America, if you look at the United States as a whole, we incarcerate 1/3 of the world's prisoners of women, of female prisoners. So 1/3 of all of the female prisoners across the globe are housed in prison facilities across the United States. So as we look ahead to the future, I think we definitely have to answer the question of how could we see an 800% increase in women incarcerated over the past 3 decades. And what does that mean if you look specifically at that impact of children, and knowing then that children with an incarcerated mother are 5 times more likely to go into foster care, those larger implications on how children, families, and communities are impacted by this drastic increase in the number of women being incarcerated.
And Renée, I want to give you an opportunity if you'd like to weigh in on that as well.
No, I think she's covered it very well. It's a huge concern around this issue of women in incarceration, and also around, because NCCP is very concerned about child development, this issue of how the witnessing of a parent's arrest, both mothers and fathers, affects children in terms of flashbacks, externalizing and internalizing behavior. So it's all extremely important in terms of how it affects the children and their development.
A traumatic experience. Yeah. Another question is about for-profit prisons. Some states, like Louisiana, as mentioned, have a lot of private for-profit prisons. Are you aware of differences between federal prisons and these for-profit facilities in costs or the access to phone communication?
I think specifically one of the challenges related to the private facilities is the release of the data related to the commissions that they're receiving and those private contracts that they're entering into. So a part of the work of Prison Legal News, they've served as an invaluable resource to start highlighting some of the trends that we're seeing related to the actual cost of these prison phone calls. But the one piece that I would say to specifically that still needs additional exploration then is what's happening in some of the private facilities that host people who are in some type of immigration proceeding or some other issue related to immigration status. Most of those facilities tend to be private facilities. So specifically, how is that impacting the families and also those who are held there? If we look more broadly at the federal prisons and then also the emergence of these private prisons, I mean, some of the larger challenges are related to their policies and practices. Is that enforcing then and encouraging quotas to have more people incarcerated in these in these private facilities? So I think there are some larger systemic issues that we'd have to address specifically related to the private prisons, and the main one being access to the data for their practices and policies, and also to ensure that those particular facilities are following some of the same regulations of federal or state facilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a related question has both data and policy implications. It is that time is taken out of the call periodically when they will say, for example, this is a global tell and you are talking to a prisoner and the family is paying for that time. Has that come up?
I'm not aware of how that's calculated into the specific cost of the phone calls. Now, it has come up as an issue as far as family members and prisoners saying that they're not receiving their full time based upon some of the reports that I saw even reported to our state level Attorney General's office. But as far as the actual calculations, I'm not certain how that message time is fitting into the overall call cost and structure. But there is one other issue that I just would like to highlight briefly that also emerged out of the research as well, is the challenge oftentimes that people face in trying to remain and get in contact with their attorneys. So a kind of offshoot and correlated issue is whether or not the call cost also serves as a barrier for accessing and protecting your legal rights.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Interesting. One question came in about getting the slides, and the slides will be posted on the SSRC website shortly, not probably today, but within a couple weeks. And another question that came up about the interviews and whether or not the issue of child support ever came up in the survey or interview responses.
No, the issue of child support was not raised.
Uh-huh.
And Chris, I just want to say in terms of child support that we're very concerned when we talk about mass incarceration and the fact that, and reintegration, and the fact that lots of offenders can't access government programs that are important to poor and low-income families, such as SNAP, public housing, TANF. So, you know, where are the funds for child support before or during or after incarceration?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. That's a very good point. There's another question about the amount of time it takes to enroll for prepaid accounts and whether or not that could be faster. Clearly, this is a very complex issue with many, many elements, but the time that it takes to enroll in these programs.
I think that's a very practical concern, and that is something that needs to be improved as well, because if we go to that larger issue of what's the quality of the cost, what's the access related to cost, all of those things, I think if they were, you know, in any other consumer setting, that there would be a national outcry to say, you know, I'm paying these call costs, my call is being dropped, the call quality is poor. So I think that goes back to that earlier question of if there's a stigmatization in some ways of policies that impact prisoners and their families.
Mm-hmm. This person finishes with a question about becoming a victim of fraud in the course of doing this application, which is yet another element. We have reached the end of our time. I want to thank you for a very stimulating and valuable conversation. Renée, for being an excellent discussant. Thank you to the audience. Please, if you can, do the survey, the poll, before leaving. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you.
Thanks, Dr. Tyner.
Thank you all for the opportunity to share.
Thank you. And again, ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's webinar. Thank you all again for your participation.